May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Let's be seated. I am the living bread. We are in the third week of what is called the bread discourse in the Gospel of John. Just for preemptive purposes, we have two more, so stay tuned, it keeps coming. But why does it keep coming? I think one of the first things we need to notice and remember, and I may have said this before, because nothing we ever say is original, but remember that in John, all of Jesus' signs, all of Jesus' miracles, all of his actions are all designed to point to God. His stories are all designed to point to God. It's all about relationship with God. It's all about trusting God. That's probably true in most of the Synoptic Gospels, but in John it's particularly understood that his language is just all about how is it that we can always bring ourselves back to God, back to center. And isn't that often what Eucharist does for many of us? If we've learned so much about what we miss in the last year and a half. Especially, and most importantly, perhaps, as we start to get things back. What did we miss and why? The Eucharist, people have talked a lot about missing the Eucharist. And yet the other thing I've heard from a lot of you, not denoting the fact that people miss Eucharist, but also how people felt like they found ways to connect with each other in ways they didn't expect. Through these funny little boxes that you're all in. And then some of us, even though we love being here, actually miss seeing everybody's face. I'm working on that. But how is it? Because we all can't, both and isn't always possible. But we have found, how do we point to God? One of the ways we learned in the last year and a half is when we see the faces of the children of God in front of us. There's something about that fills us up. We're used to coming to church and all facing me, poor things. One of the great things is how is it that we can start to learn and see each other's faces. So we hear Jesus this morning, yet again in this bread discourse, that this bread is supposed to be a sign, not in and of itself, but the action. How is it that Jesus can fill us up? How is it? Well, maybe one of the things that's funny is, I love the fact that this week and last week they talked about the people complaining. Because right now, especially things like with COVID and with masks, you all know this, I would not want to be a superintendent of a school, I would not want to be on a principal of a school, where whatever your position is on care for the other, pray for them all, because there are no decisions that will please people. They just aren't, because we don't know that unprecedented thing, right? Because we don't know. But we do know that Jesus is here to let us know that our job is to care for the other. Our job is to care for the other. So who is Jesus for you? What does that mean? That is such a not Episcopal thing to ask. Who is Jesus to you? But I just don't think there's any coincidence that during this time, God called Michael Curry to be our leader. Because he is such a pastor and prophet. My guess is he probably doesn't know. He knows how to read a spreadsheet, but I bet it's not his favorite thing. But boy, does he know how to tell us about Jesus. And so who is Jesus to us? And maybe it's okay as Episcopalians to come to know a little bit about Jesus. This week I was sitting with a bunch of people from this church, and they were talking about how they had sent cards out. And they'd sent a couple cards to different people, and it was mostly just to let people know that they were thinking of them. And the blessing ended up being this grace thing happened that they didn't expect. People sent cards back to them. Isn't that how God works? That's such a simple, old school kind of thing, right? Sending a note. And that can happen on email. It doesn't have to just be a note. But each person was blessed with, they were saying, it was so nice to just have this person send a note back. How is it that we can have our faith be part of our daily lives? Michael Curry always says, and you've heard me say it a million times, if it's not about love, it's not about Jesus. So if we were to imagine, what is it? What is it that this bread of life means? How is it that the Gospel of John and all this talk about bread can be implemented into our daily life? Well, one of the things he decided early on in his pastorate was these practices of the way of love. Because it's easy, or it's not, to read these or think about or pray about these tangential things. But what do we do? How does it hit the ground? How would it matter? How does it matter? How do I find Jesus in my daily life? And he and a group of theologians put together this way that he calls the way of love. And it's things that we can do, because where do we find Jesus in our day? The first thing he says is pause, just turn. Remember, turning, reconciliation, turning back to God. God knows that we are not always going to be focused on God. God already knows us because God created us, right? So God knows we're going to go rogue and get in the weeds. And so even in our baptismal covenant, it is I will with God's help. So the first thing is stop and turn and just notice. Notice where God is in your day. Notice the simple things like getting a card back, or maybe sending a card and never hearing back and just knowing that you said hi. It's little things. You don't know when you're going to be a seed. Somebody I know is going through something, and this person knew that this book might land in a place that might help. And they just sent it to see what would happen. You never know, so stop and turn. Pray. The next thing he says is learn. We Episcopalians have not spent a lot of time learning our scripture. We don't quote it as easily as many other traditions. We have talked a lot about spirituality and theology, but how is it that we spend some time with the stories of Jesus? There are all kinds of ways to do it. You can do it on your own. You can do it with us. But learn, read stuff. Different ones of us. You'll hear us all talking. Oh, I like Richard Rohr. Oh, I like Mary Daly. Well, who the heck is that? Somebody might say. Very good question. And pray. Pray. I am the living bread. We hear in the gospel this morning. Living means not dead. Like, don't need to get complicated, but it means not dead. And living isn't necessarily the little wafer you're going to get today. What makes it living is participating in this whole liturgy. But the living Jesus happens in relationship with each other, happens in relationship with the world. So praying is how you do that. There's no perfect way to do it. We have great prayers in our prayer book. If you need a prayer book, let us know. Little stories of grace that I hear. Somebody in the congregation didn't have a prayer book, and they told somebody else in the congregation. That person had an extra one. The next Sunday, that person gave the person that was wondering a prayer book, and they were grateful. Not a miracle, but maybe it felt like a grace-filled moment to both people. So how is it that we pray and notice, we listen? We worship, we gather together. We have learned so much about gathering together in prayer, hearing the story of Jesus, hearing each other's stories. And we've learned and seen that it doesn't all have to be in this building, even though we love it and are glad to be together. We've also gotten to know each other's living rooms, and we've gotten to know the Steeles and Mr. Steele's pretend office. We've gotten to know who has Carol. Humphrey has a lovely peach room that I just need to find out what color her paint is. It's lovely. We worship together in small groups and in large groups. We bless each other. Sometimes we bless each other with presents. Sometimes if you come to the altar and you want a blessing, you can do that. Sometimes it's just the blessing of your presence or hearing. Maybe you think, my gosh, I haven't heard from so-and-so. You call them, and lo and behold, they were really glad to call. Go. Jesus does all this for us so that we can take it out. You know, we spend so much time, and I can be guilty of this too, working on my spiritual life, working on my relationship with God, and all these things that continue to heal and change me a day at a time. I am not the woman I was when I began this journey, thanks to God's grace. And so many people, but the reason God helps us do that work is so that we can go forth and let others know that with God, anything is possible. And trust me, if God can do this kind of work in someone like me, God can work in anyone. That is our work. And then lastly, for us to be able to be the way of love, we need to rest. We need to rest. We need to receive the gift of God's grace. We need to be patient and prayerful. Those are all ways that we can be in relationship with God. Because at the end of the day, remember, John says, you are the vine and I am the branches. We need to keep the vine alive and healthy and well. We need to remember that God is central to all of this. And we get to be reminded on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, whenever God reminds us and we have the wherewithal to listen and turn to God, remind us that we are never alone and that God is with us, needs us, and that we are all called to be the children of God that God most needs us to be. And I will add, I don't know that there has ever been a time, at least in my lifetime, when we need to notice that more. Whether it's about COVID, whether it's about our political life, whether it's about being together. We are all beloved children of God. How is it that we can learn to hear and mark and inwardly digest some of what Jesus has tried to show us and teach us and feed us? And then we get to take that out into the world. And it is my fervent prayer, as it is, I'm sure, all of you, that will continue to make even a dent in some of the pain that feels so rampant, some of the judgment that feels so rampant. But I believe that the core is fear and loneliness and pain. Let us try to fill up those places with our faith in ways that might be able to help, even if it's just one other person. Jesus says, I am the living bread. Let us find ways to take that living bread in today, in whatever way God is calling you to.